Yeah, for fish sauce, because Vietnam is interested in fish sauce, we have only one study from Thailand where they made fish sauce. They fermented fish, I think very much in the same way as you fermented here. They fermented it for 12 months, and they fermented it in the shade, and they also tried to ferment it in the sun to see if there was a difference. And they measured retention. The retention was only 45%, i.e. half the iodine was lost when the fish was fermented in the sunshine. But if the fermentation took place in the shade, then the retention was high as 87%.
Oh.
And that same study, they also, having made the fish sauce with iodized salt, they also did taste tests with panelists, both from Laos and from Thailand, to see if they found any differences in the fish sauce made with iodized salt and the fish sauce made with non-iodized salt. And they found no differences in taste or color or smell, and they said they liked the fish sauce that had been made with iodized salt. There probably in most processed foods there is some iodine lost, but the amount of iodine that is lost or the amount of iodine that's retained in processed foods will vary depending on the food, and even the same food can have different production methods around the world. So I can't tell you exactly for every type of food how much iodine is retained. But globally, we do have data for retention on a wide variety of foods. We have information on bread, breakfast cereal, cheese, potato chips, different kinds of processed meats and fish, including fermented fish, pickled vegetables, and canned foods. And overall, for all of those foods, the retention is high. It's above 60%, sometimes as high as above 90%, with the exception of some canned foods, such as tomato juice. Overall, I can confirm also that we have seen measurements. Some countries have actually measured how much improvement has happened in iodine status as a result of the consumption of processed foods. For example, in Australia, all bread is made with iodized salt, whereas household salt is not iodized. It's iodized on a voluntary basis. And there, based on the bread, they have seen an increase in iodine consumption and a reduction in iodine deficiency as a result of using iodized salt in bread. Yeah, all over the world we have food processors concerned. They say, well, maybe my recipe is different or I have a different ingredient, and very often they don't want to tell you the secret of their production, so it's very hard to test it. But what I can say is that there have been a wide variety of foods tested, and just on the basis of the variety and all over the world, the overriding, there's very little foods that have any negative changes. And then just in case of something like this, for example, in the Philippines, they said, okay, if you are a food processor and if you make your food with iodized salt and there is a problem, if you can prove to us the problem and demonstrate that it causes negative impacts, then we will exempt you. And so that was what the Philippines did, just to make sure that they didn't cause any damage to any of the food processing industries. And it's interesting to report that actually, despite the fact that that article is written into their legislation, no food processor in the Philippines has ever requested an exemption. And then perhaps just another thing for the food processors in Vietnam to know is that globally there are 109 countries which have mandatory legislation for iodized salt. And in 96 of them, i.e. 88%, they require the salt for food processing to be iodized. So I'm just mentioning this because it means that in all of those countries, there's 96 countries, the processed food is made with iodized salt, and there are no significant problems reported. In fact, there are no problems reported. So it's actually a very common practice to make processed food with iodized salt, and it hasn't been a problem in other countries. So when the Vietnamese government made Decree 09, they actually specified that foods for export are exempt. And this is normal because the food that goes to another country must follow the rules of another country.
Yeah.
So companies that make food for export, they don't need to worry. They can make it with non-iodized salt. That is allowed under Decree 09. I have to say, it makes it a little more complicated for the government here in terms of monitoring, because they have to know which foods are for export and which foods are domestic. And it makes it a little bit more complicated for salt producers because now they have to make salt that's iodized for the domestic consumption and salt that's non-iodized for the export. Yeah. But, you know, principally the foods for export are exempt. But I would have to say, if I was a food processor and I was making a food for export and the government there did not say anything about iodine or allowed iodine, then I would just use iodized salt.
Yeah.
Keep it simple. You know, and I think that that's another point that I'd like to make is that, you know, the government had to make a law that was effective. They want more iodine for the population to prevent iodine deficiency, but they also had to make it feasible and easy to implement.
Yeah.
Now, it would be nice. It would be something that many countries actually have tried to do. They do an education campaign. They say, you know, iodine is good. We're making iodized salt, and you must choose to buy iodized salt. But unfortunately, what we found in many countries is that despite good education campaigns, people really often will not choose food on the basis of what's the most healthy. And in particular, something like fortification is something they cannot see. They cannot see that there's iodine in the salt. So for them, iodized salt and non-iodized salt actually is the same thing. And they also cannot see iodine deficiency. So it is very hard to actually provide enough education to a population to persuade them to change their behavior and purchase iodized product, which they don't see the difference, they cannot taste the difference, and they don't see that they have a deficiency. You know, and so that's definitely one of the problems. The other problem is that the people who will listen to that kind of education, you know, maybe are more educated. They're the people who live in towns. They're the people who are richer. The people who really need it are the ones who will be least able to hear that information and to act upon that information. And also, as long as there's both iodized and non-iodized salt in the market, the iodized salt will usually be more expensive. So not only do you have to change your behavior and have awareness, you now have to pay more money. And so again, time and time again in countries we've seen that doing it on a voluntary basis and trying to do it through public education doesn't work. You know, and actually we have a very good example here in Vietnam. You used to have mandatory legislation for salt, starting in about 94 until 2005. And production of iodized salt was very successful and very easy, and all the households were eating iodized salt, and iodine deficiency was reduced through all the provinces and all the regions, and both women and children. But then in 2005, the government thought, okay, the problem is solved. We will now make it voluntary because everybody already knows about salt. Iodine, you know, everybody is used to using it. We can make it voluntary. And unfortunately, by 2011, when the next survey was done, the proportion of households using iodized salt had fallen from above 90% in 2005 to 45% in 2011. And then subsequent studies also measured iodine status and saw that that had declined. So, for example, many women in Vietnam are now iodine deficient. And it's for that reason that Decree 09 was actually brought back again, because we could see that voluntary salt iodization did not work in Vietnam, as in many other countries. So iodine deficiency is very common throughout the world, and it's one of the reasons that so many countries have mandatory legislation for salt iodization. But nevertheless, obviously, we don't want to put enough iodine in the salt and then have some people maybe who are not iodine deficient eat the salt and become iodine excess. But within salt, we're aiming to provide people with about 150 micrograms of salt, of iodine per day. Whereas in order to say that you're eating too much, you would have to eat more than 1,000 micrograms per day on a regular basis. So you can see that iodized salt is never going to cause somebody to eat too much. And one of the reasons salt is such a good vehicle is we cannot eat too much salt. If we put it in water, you know, or maybe some other product, there may be some people who eat a lot of, drink a lot of water and actually could get too much. But with something like salt, the amount of salt we eat is very finely controlled by our body. And then the other thing I think I want to emphasize is that the Vietnamese government has plans, but it's normal to monitor what we achieve. We want to monitor how many households are eating iodized salt, how many food processors are using iodized salt, and we want to measure iodine status. We would start to see that in the monitoring data, and we would be able to change it. And fortification is very, very easy to change the amount of iodine that's added to the salt to adjust, fine-tune your program. So, you know, I don't think people need to be worried about that. It would be extremely hard to consume too much iodine, even if you were not iodine deficient
Yeah.
at the time that the program was started.